Hello, Greg. How are you?
Good. Hola.
Greg, very nice to meet you. Thank you very much for having me. I know you are very, very busy, and but I'm pretty sure that Brazilian community is gonna be very, very happy with this interview.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you.
Sure. So, Greg, I know that the subject of the day is the full cycle developers model. But before we start with that, do you mind to introduce yourself a little bit, talking a little bit more about yourself, your career, and your story with Netflix?
Sure, certainly. My name is Greg Burrell. I live in the United States, in California, in the Silicon Valley. I have been at Netflix for 15 years, which is a very long time, I realize. When I started there in 2005, Netflix was just starting this idea, what if we could send movies over the internet? Because up to 2005, Netflix had been a company that mailed DVDs through the mail. We had warehouses all over the country that put DVD discs into envelopes and mailed them to our customers. Well, that was very successful, but the question came up: can we get these movies to our customers faster? Why do they have to wait 2 or 3 days for the mail to get delivered to their household? There's this new thing called the internet. Maybe we can use that. So a small little experimental group within Netflix started up to play around with this idea of what if we could send movies over the internet? Wouldn't that be cool? And so I was part of this team, this experimental team, a little group within Netflix, almost a startup within a startup. And we experimented for several years with just different ideas of how we can make this work as a business model, how we can make this work in a way that's comfortable and friendly to our customers. How can we make this work in a way that scales? Because, hey, if you can send movies over the internet, that's going to take off. That's going to be huge. And so we need to think about how we're going to make this scale. And once we free ourselves from the confines of the United States Postal Service, the world becomes open to us. So there's a lot of challenges ahead of us, but we wanted to do it right. We didn't want to put out a product that our customers would find confusing or have a lot of technical difficulty with. So we spent several years to get it right to a place where we thought, our customers are ready to start using this. And so I've been along that journey the whole time, working with the team, and we've gone through many iterations, many different organizational changes, and we've also employed a variety of models in how we structure ourselves and our work. And so out of all this learning, this history, this observations, we arrived at this, what we call the full cycle developer model. And to be honest, it didn't sound that unusual to me. But we thought, hey, let's just share it out there on our Netflix tech blog and see what other people think. And so here we are today.
Wow, that's nice because I think the first time I saw your article, I thought, oh my g, it's exactly what I think. It's mainly because the sense of commitment, the sense of ownership that developers have to have nowadays in a lot of different projects that think you have to operate, you have to test, you have to develop what you build. You are responsible for what you are creating, and this kind of mindset, at least for me, I think is the one of the most important parts of the full cycle developers model. Sometimes there are a lot of developers that still think that you have to only develop and then the rest is with the sysadmin, the ops guys, the ops teams. And then for me it's very, very nice, this kind of model. But for you, if you have to define what is the full cycle developers model, what is that for you?
Yeah, you hit on Wesley hit on two of the key important things. One is ownership, and two is a mindset. It's not necessarily a set of technologies or skills. It's really a mindset. The mindset that you own all, you as a developer slash operator own all aspects of the software development lifecycle. You own designing your software, developing and testing. Okay, maybe you already do the design and development. Maybe you have some team. Some companies have a separate team for doing testing. Well, now you own the testing as well because you know the software, you designed it, you know how to test it well, and that goes further through the life cycle. You're responsible for deployment. You are not handing off your software to an operations team. You are deploying it yourself, and you are operating it. And what does that mean? It means on a day-to-day basis, how healthy is your application or service? How well is it doing? How is it encountering errors? Are you scaling well? Are you able to meet the needs of the business with your particular software? What is your customer experience? And when I speak of customers, it can be your company's customers, like our people watching movies, but it's also internal customers. Maybe you're part of one microservice in a larger ecosystem. And so your customers are people.
Yeah, developers like are consuming your API, for example.
Exactly. Other teams that are consuming your API. And in turn, you're consuming APIs of other teams as well. So you're part of this ecosystem. So you need to operate and support within that ecosystem. So how well is your service playing with others? And when other services in this ecosystem run into problems, they may come to you for support. They may show up on your support channel and say, hey, we're getting this unusual error from your service. Can you help us troubleshoot that? And so that it becomes an important part of operating your service as well. So the full cycle model is really a mindset shift from I'm only going to focus on writing code and expanding that to now I own all aspects and I own each one equally. It's not like my real job is developing and I'll do the other things if I have to. It's like, no, operating is as important to developing new features. Because it's great if I develop lots of features, but if they're not running well in production, if people are having trouble with them, if they're causing problems, if other services can't use it, what good is that, right? So it's important to me as a developer to make sure that my service is up, healthy, running, easy to use, that I provided whatever documentation I need so others can use my API, that I respond in a timely way to their questions. That's as important as writing a new feature. That doing my testing is as important. That having a clean, smooth deployment is very important. So all these things have equal importance, and that's kind of the mindset shift, really, from traditionally just thinking I'm a developer, I write code. When I submit my code to the repo, to Git or whatever, then I'm done. In the full cycle model, you're not done. You're just one part along the cycle. Now you've got to take it to the next part.
Wow. That's nice, and but there's one thing that a lot of different people normally ask me when I'm talking about like full cycle. For example, what's the difference between a full cycle developer and a full stack developer? And what's the difference between a full cycle developer and a developer who knows DevOps, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I realize that these terms are not fixed. There's everyone has their slight different variation of what these terms mean. So to me, a full stack developer is someone who can develop on the front end and the back end as well. So to a full stack developer, it's all code, right? Whether you're writing code, JavaScript for the front end, whether you're writing Java or Python in the back end, it's code, right? But and we have full stack developers within our full cycle model. So here at Netflix, we have lots of full stack developers, and that's what we hire is full stack developers. But your responsibilities don't end with your code. Sure, you create some wonderful front end code, you create some really robust, scalable back end code. Now you are responsible for taking that code and going through the rest of this life cycle, right? You want to test that code, to deploy, to operate, to support. Everything involved in the entire life cycle you own, you are responsible for, and you have control over. So, yes, I don't think of it as an either or. We have full stack developers who work in the full cycle model. Now, your second question about what's the difference between with a full stack developer who knows DevOps, I think the answer is in the wording. A full stack developer who knows DevOps is probably treating DevOps as something secondary. Maybe they have some knowledge of DevOps, maybe they do a few things, but there's a mindset that that's not my real job. That's something I'll do on the side. uh, Being a full cycle means you're learning about all the things required that are required to deploy and operate. You're concerned as much about visibility, about metrics, about being able having observability over your service as well. You're equally concerned with either doing support or creating support tools so your customer, your partners can self-service themselves for support questions. All those things are equal of equal importance. And so we did try, we did try here at Netflix a model where we had full stack developers who were also going to do some DevOps stuff on the side. And that didn't really work out because they were focused, primarily on developing. That was their real job, and they didn't get it when things got tight, when deadlines were coming, when priorities were made. All the other things kind of got second priority, which meant they didn't get done.
And then go to the sysadmin and say, my job is done.
It's not just thinking about DevOps; it's doing the DevOps. It's doing the deployments. It's thinking this service needs to be operated and it's going to take a lot of traffic. How am I going to run that service? How am I going to get the visibility into the health of that service? How am I going to make it so we can be notified when that service is becoming unhealthy? You're thinking, you're thinking and you're doing, right? So maybe how that feeds back, I think one of the key things is there's a real tight feedback cycle within your own team, right? So we are operating a service. We want to have visibility. We want to have observability about that service. Oh, so when we do, we better go back and add some instrumentation to our service to be able to monitor it well. We're getting this kind of support questions. Maybe we need to go back into our service and add some code to deal with that particular issue or to make it easier to use our service. Maybe we're getting a lot of support requests from people using our API. Well, perhaps we need to improve our documentation around using that API and provide some code examples for our partners as well. So it's not just it's not just writing out for other teams. We've tried the model before where we had an operations team, we had a build and release engineer. In fact, I was the build and release engineer for a long time, and so we had a model where people would just go and fill out a form, open up a ticket, and say, "Please do this work," and hand it off and forget about it, and it was not their problem anymore, right? And so I would pick up a ticket, or a sysadmin would pick up a ticket, or a network administrator would pick up a ticket, and try and figure out what this all meant, and then usually have to go back and forth to get clarity. And there was a real lack of seeing the bigger picture, a lack of being able to provide clear feedback to all aspects of the cycle. There was also a lack of ownership, right? So a developer could just say, "Hey, I'm done with this code. I'm going to throw it over, open a ticket, on to the next thing." An administrator could say, "Okay, I've got to deploy this. I'm going to deploy it. I don't know how well it's running. I don't know if I did this right, but it seems good enough. I'm done with the ticket. On to the next ticket," right? And so we became very siloed. There were a lot of, our sysadmins were excellent. They were very specialized. They knew sysadmin. Our build and release engineer, he could do build and release really well. That's me. Our developers were great at developing. We each person was really good at what they were doing, but information became very siloed within those teams. Responsibility, feedback cycles became really siloed. It became easy to blame the other team. Oh, those sysadmins, they totally made a mistake with my deployment. I had great code. I delivered great code. I don't know what they did with it. Or deployment,
My
system
machine works.
administration. Yeah, system administrators could say, "Oh, well, they gave us bad code. What can we do?" Right? And so a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blaming, and everyone only had visibility and ownership for their single part of the life cycle. No one was really looking at the whole big picture. And so this model gave us that visibility, gave us that sense of ownership, gave us a really close, tight feedback loops, because as a developer, if I'm feeling the pain of operating the service, I'm feeling the difficulty of deploying it, I'm feeling how much work there is just supporting it, and so I can now do something about that.
Wow, that's nice. But always we have this kind of people who thinks that there's something behind it. For example, I heard some people saying that's a kind of play of the companies that want to save money and then hiring less people and then pushing more and more responsibilities for the developers. For full cycle developers, do you think you have to increase the size of the team in order to people can train each other? How do you think is the cycle of learning for this kind of guys be totally prepared to do deploys, testing, creating documentation, designing application, and then alerts and everything that you need to keep an application up and running.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I hear that often as well. Isn't this just a way to save money? We can, we can get rid of all the system administrators. We can get rid of the build and release engineers. We can get rid of a whole test team. Hey, great! We're going to run we're going to do everything we need to do with just developers. We have great developers. They're wonderful. They can do everything. If that's your mindset, if that's your goal, is to save money, then it's going to fail. I will tell you that flat out. It will fail. And in fact, what we found was we did actually need to increase our resources on this. We needed more people. And the reason is this. This is not, developing at the same pace all day and then at night you go and do some operational work and then late at night you do some support work. That's not going to work. You can't just pile on to the existing capabilities, to the existing workload, because that's just going to fail. You're going to get people who are really frustrated. You get people who are really burned out. All areas will suffer then. Your code will suffer, your operations will suffer, your availability will suffer, your customers will suffer. It's not scalable. It doesn't do well. It overloads people. It burns them out. It makes them very frustrated and unhappy. They will leave. They will do poor work. It's not a recipe for saving money. The way we made this work, I will say there's two important things. One is recognizing that everything in the cycle is equally important, and so that means if a developer needs to spend some time looking into the health of the service or maybe improving the availability of the service, that is as important as providing a new feature. And so you should budget the amount of time. Instead of budgeting the same amount of time for feature development, take some of that time and say, all right, today you're going to do operation work, or maybe this week you're on call for incidents, for whenever there's an alert that goes off that says something's wrong with your service, you'll be the on-call person to respond to that. And during that week that you're on call, nobody's going to expect you to develop code because you're busy. You're not only responding to these alerts, but you're also looking for ways to maybe improve our dashboards, to improve our alerts, to improve our metrics, to improve our observability of the system. And so that takes that amount of work is treated and prioritized alongside feature development as well. So what does this mean? It means maybe a developer in some companies who don't do full cycle, they might be developing code 7 hours a day, purely writing code, submitting it, getting it reviewed, and that's that. In the full cycle model, that same developer may do 3 hours of code, maybe an hour of testing, maybe does an hour, maybe 30 minutes to investigate some deployment issue, maybe does another hour to see how his new feature is running in production. Maybe she spends another hour looking for ways to improve that feature that she just wrote. Maybe they spend another 30 minutes answering a couple of support questions. So all these things take time, and that needs to be prioritized equally by managers, by people who are making these decisions. So it's important for the success of this model to treat each thing equally and not treat development code features as the main thing and everything else as an add-on, because that just won't work. The second key to making this work is, okay, so can anybody really be an expert in all these areas now? Maybe you had a really good developer and she was wonderful at writing code. Now you're asking her to also do deployments and operations and support. How can she be good at all that? Well, one of the key that you need to realize that there's going to need to be training and there's going to need to be tooling. So we provide our developers with really good tooling they could use, for example, to do deployments. We have a team within Netflix has developed a tool called Spinnaker, which is a deployment tool. It's taken off. That team is solely focused on Spinnaker. They work with our full cycle developers to say, hey, what are the difficulties in deploying software? We'll build some tools that meet those needs. We'll provide this expert tooling and consulting. Our full cycle developers, sure, they know some things about security. They probably know a lot about security, but we have security experts on call, on staff, who can come in and say, you need help with security? We'll help you with it. We'll sit down and look at your code and we'll look at your architecture and address any security concerns. So yeah, you're great. You know a lot about security. We're experts. We'll help you know even more. So it's important that teams and managers make time for that training for their engineers to learn, and that you have the support they need via tooling, via expertise, consulting. So in that sense, we didn't really reduce our employee count. We increased it but these central teams that are providing tools like Spinnaker or Atlas or whatever, those teams they're really empowering these full cycle developers to become very responsible for the whole cycle.
Actually, what you guys did, you create a kind of ecosystem all to support these developers in order to give them autonomy, and then they can deploy, they can change the way that they're gonna do the deployments, to use like Spinnaker. That's a fantastic tool. Yeah, it's really amazing. And I don't know if you can share with me, but how many people normally you have in your teams it varies a lot?
Yeah, it varies. Typically, we do very small teams, maybe 10 to 15 people. I think 10 is probably 10 to 12 is probably about an average. Very small teams. That small team may own one or more microservices, or that team may own one or more tools that they produce. And so these are very fairly small teams that become the experts in that one service. So to give an example, we may have a team that operates a DRM, a digital rights management service, used for when you play a movie. It hits the DRM service and gives you a license to play that movie. That team, they're experts in developing and operating a DRM service. They know all about how that DRM service works in the ecosystem. They know how it works with the players. They know how it works with other systems that are calling theirs. They are experts in operating that service and knowing, what its capabilities are, what its performance is like, when they need to address different performance bottlenecks. They're really expert in how to operate a DRM service or a Java microservice. They get the support they need from the other tooling teams, from the more central teams. And each of those central teams, all right, we have a Spinnaker team. That's a fairly large team, but within Spinnaker, there are small sub-teams. They are experts in providing this tooling that does deployment and deliveries. They can provide that tooling. They can provide best practices and guidance as well, so that the team building the DRM service can say, hey, we've got a solid tool. We know how it works. We can tailor it to our individual desire, interest. Not every team, we don't just pick a tool and say you must use it this way. Each team can really tailor it to their individual personalities, their individual needs, to their individual technology, and
the result, basically.
Yeah, and the result is that they have what you said, autonomy. You use a great word, autonomy. They have a feeling of we are experts in our service, and we control how that service is deployed. We control how it's operated. We control how it's supported. And they feel that sense of control and the sense of ownership. And that makes them feel really invested. One thing I'd like to point out about this model is, it's to anybody who's worked in a startup, it's very familiar, because when you're in a startup, you kind of do everything. You wear a lot of hats. Sure, you develop the product and the code, but maybe they need, today they need some other help with something, deployment or something. Well, you might be the guy doing that as well. Or if in a small startup, you might be hired as a developer, but they need help operating that service, that getting it off the ground. And so maybe
To
today you're
have
doing
a
that.
startup for each microservice.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So that sense of doing many things, and they're all important to the success. That's really a lot of feeling that you get from being in a startup. And so what we really sought to do is take that same sense of ownership, same sense of control, and make it work in a larger company like Netflix.
Sometimes, and I can say that being a full cycle developer can be a bit overwhelming, because you need to learn a lot of stuff, and mainly when you don't have a company that can support all these different types of technology. So sometimes you need to learn Docker, Kubernetes, Istio, and then Prometheus, Elastic Stack, and a lot of different stacks to make it work. How? What's your advice for guys who want to be full cycle developers? How should they balance their knowledge to in order to do not kind of burn out?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good question. That's a really good question, because that is one of the dangers, is the burnout that you speak of, the sense of overwhelming. Let me first start by saying that this model is not going to work for every company. And in fact, I know there are some industries where this doesn't work. For example, in the financial services industry, where there are requirements about who is allowed to access the production systems. There may be government regulations that are involved, such that it just doesn't work. A developer can't get access to the production systems to do the operator support or deployments. So this model does not work everywhere. Secondly, if your company cannot invest in the time it takes to train, and not just initial training, but keeping up training, new tools, new technologies, new best practices, that requires time commitment, and it requires the support of a company. So if a company cannot support that kind of time commitment to train, to build tools, to have expertise on hand, then that's going to make it less likely, and that's going to largely lead to the feeling of burnout. Now, I mentioned similarities with the startup model, and that is one of the familiar thing in startups, is that people do come away feeling burned out because they're expected just to do too many things. So a key to making this model work is to be realistic and say, look, we have wonderful developers and they can do lots of things. They're excellent, but there's only so much they can do. So we are going to allocate enough time for them to maybe learn more about Kubernetes, for what they need to do and for what they may want to do with it next month or next year, further down next quarter. Not necessarily expect that, hey, you're going to keep up with this hectic pace, but that sometimes it's necessary for a developer or a team to slow down, invest the time they need to learning these tools, to putting in the time, and then at the end, the result will be that they'll feel more comfortable, they'll feel less overwhelmed, they'll feel less burnt out, they won't want to leave, and more importantly, they'll feel a real sense of, hey, I have my service. Not only did I write the code, but now I operate it, I support it, I own it, we own this, and we're doing great with this. And that can be really rewarding, that sense of ownership over the entire service. So when someone comes to your team and says, hey, what do you guys do? We build the DRM service and we operate it and it's doing great, and look at
Are the DRM guys, and then that's okay. I like that. Greg, to finish, what's your advice for Brazilians developer who are willing to become a full cycle developer? Do you have some advice for them? Like, as of course, there are many developers who don't work in big companies and companies that have this kind of structure that can support for every different area, and then sometimes these guys, they are kind of along this journey, and sometimes he knows if he understands these concepts, if he can have this mindset shift, he can sometime in one day work at Netflix. What's your advice for these guys?
We're always hiring, you know, we're always looking for people, and we love it when someone comes in knowing this full stack, full cycle model and full stack, but also full cycle model, and says, yeah, that sounds really interesting. You know, I've heard sort of two different reactions to this model. Some people say that sounds terrifying, and some people say, yeah, that sounds really exciting and empowering. Let me do that. Advice I can give, there's a couple of things. One is, if your company is really not going to support this model, you're just going to end up very frustrated, and you may become the guy or the woman who ends up taking on all the work without any real payoff or recognition or reward for that. So I think it's very important to have that conversation with your manager. And even if your company is not supporting this model, you can still go to your managers, hey, look, I'm interested in this model. Maybe I can take on some of these additional things, but I need your support to give me the time to take on some of these additional things, to ramp up, to learn more about, you know, deploying and operating. And in return, I mean, that's the benefit to your manager. It's a benefit to your company if you know more about it, right? You're not so specialized. Now you have additional skills. You can understand the deployment space. You can understand the operational space, and that feeds back into the code and the product you're delivering. So I think one thing you can do to get started if your company is not on this model is have that conversation with your manager and say, look, I want to learn these things. Here's the benefits it will be to the team and to the company. But in return, I'm going to need some time to learn about these and to explore them and to further educate myself. And so you need to be willing to give me that time. So I think you know, the company does not necessarily have to go all in to make this work. I think it's possible to make it work.
It's a big change to do this overnight, basically. Yeah,
it is a big change, and I don't think you can necessarily just come into work one day and flip a switch and say, today we're all full cycle, right? Yeah, so I think there's ways you can get there as a company. I think there's ways you can get there as a team, and I think there's ways you can get there as an individual. But you know, it starts with the willingness to take that mindset shift. You know, to realize that, hey, you know, if our developers do more than just write code, if they understand these other aspects, that's a benefit to the company, and it's a benefit to the developers. And they're going to be happier developers, and they're going to be more engaged with the work, and the company will benefit. And you know, there's benefits all around. So I think it all starts with that mindset shift.
So, Greg, thank you very much for your attention. I'm pretty sure that Brazil is going to love this interview, and I wish the best for you.
Oh, thank you for this opportunity. I like talking. You can tell I'm very passionate about this. We've had a lot of success with this at Netflix. You know, I think it is an interesting way of working that appeals to a lot of people. So thank you for this opportunity. Obrigado.
That's nice. Thank you very much, Greg.